He played chess with the lonely prisoner, daily, never knowing he was the former emperor. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. The detention facility on Orbex Prime was a forgotten place, a gray structure buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and dust. Prisoners who were deemed no longer dangerous but too politically sensitive to release were kept in comfortable obscurity. Nathan Brooks had taken the job as a cultural liaison officer because it paid well and required minimal effort, mostly filing reports that nobody read and occasionally checking on inmates who posed no threat to anyone. He never expected to find a friend in cell block 7. The day Nathan first met the prisoner in cell 42, he was simply doing his rounds, clipboard in hand, checking boxes on forms that would be filed away and forgotten. The cell was larger than most, more like a modest apartment with walls that could not be breached. Inside sat an elderly man with silver hair and eyes that seemed to contain entire galaxies. He was hunched over a chessboard, studying the pieces with an intensity that made Nathan pause at the doorway. The old man looked up and a smile creased his weathered face. His voice was warm with an accent that Nathan could not quite place, something ancient and refined that suggested education far beyond what most prisoners possessed. He introduced himself simply as Marcus, and when he asked if played chess, there was such hope in his voice that Nathan could not bring himself to say no, even though he had only learned the basics as a child. That first game was embarrassing. Nathan lost in 12 moves. His king checkmated before he fully understood what had happened, but Marcus was patient, kind, even explaining each mistake with the care of a teacher who genuinely wanted his student to improve. He reset the board and suggested they play again, and Nathan, having nothing better to do for the next hour, agreed. The games became a daily ritual. Nathan would finish his morning reports, grab 2 cups of synthetic coffee from the staff lounge, and make his way to cell 42. Marcus was always waiting, the chessboard already set up, positioned on a small table by the window that looked out onto the gray courtyard below. They would play, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 2, and gradually Nathan began to improve. Marcus never spoke about his past, and Nathan never asked. It was an unspoken rule in the detention facility that the staff did not pry into the histories of the inmates, especially those in the high-security political wing. Nathan assumed Marcus had been some kind of government official who had fallen out of favor, perhaps a diplomat or administrator who had backed the wrong political faction during one of the many coups that plagued the outer colonies. The man carried himself with dignity, spoke multiple languages fluently, and possessed knowledge about art, literature, and philosophy that suggested a life of privilege before his imprisonment. What Nathan appreciated most was that Marcus treated him like an equal, never condescending, despite the vast gap in their chess abilities and general knowledge. When Nathan mentioned his love for old Earth literature, Marcus engaged him in deep discussions about authors Nathan had only read about in school. When Nathan confessed his dream of one day traveling to the core worlds, Marcus described them in such vivid detail that Nathan could almost smell the gardens of New Terra and hear the symphonies performed in the floating concert halls of Europa Station. Months passed and the friendship deepened. Nathan began bringing better coffee, occasionally smuggling in real food from the outside, small luxuries that Marcus accepted with gracious thanks. In return, Marcus taught Nathan not just chess but lessons about strategy, patience, and the art of reading people. He spoke in metaphors, using the chessboard as a canvas to illustrate principles about life, power, and the consequences of decisions made in haste. One afternoon, as autumn winds began to howl outside the facility, Nathan arrived to find Marcus staring out the window with an expression of profound sadness. The chessboard sat untouched. Nathan set down the coffee cups and waited, having learned that sometimes his friend needed silence more than conversation. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He said he had been thinking about regret, about the choices he had made and the people he had hurt through ignorance or arrogance. He asked Nathan if he believed in redemption, if someone who had caused great suffering could ever truly atone for their mistakes. Nathan considered the question carefully. He said he believed that people could change, that recognition of past wrongs was the first step toward becoming better. He added that in his experience, the worst people were those who never questioned themselves, who never felt remorse. The fact that Marcus was capable of such reflection suggested he was not beyond redemption. Marcus smiled then, a sad but grateful expression, and thanked Nathan for his kindness. He said that Nathan had given him something precious during these games, something he had not experienced in many years. When Nathan asked what that was, Marcus replied simply that it was being seen as a person rather than a symbol, being valued for who he was rather than what he represented. They played chess that day with particular intensity, and for the first time in months Nathan actually won. Marcus applauded, genuinely delighted, and said that the student had finally surpassed the teacher. Nathan laughed, knowing it was not true, suspecting that Marcus had let him win, but appreciating the gesture nonetheless. The facility had few visitors, which was why Nathan was surprised when a convoy of official vehicles arrived one morning, their black surfaces gleaming despite the perpetual gray drizzle that plagued Orbex Prime. Security personnel in crisp uniforms flooded the building, and Nathan was ordered to report to the warden's office immediately. Warden Patricia Cole was a stern woman who ran the facility with efficient detachment. She rarely interacted with the cultural liaison staff, considering them unnecessary bureaucratic additions forced upon her by regulations she found pointless. But today her expression was different, a mixture of anxiety and barely concealed excitement. She informed Nathan that there would be a diplomatic visit to Cell 42. Representatives from the Galactic Council who needed to speak with the prisoner. Nathan was to facilitate the meeting, ensure it proceeded smoothly, and report any unusual occurrences. When Nathan asked why the council was interested in an old man serving time for political offenses, the warden gave him a sharp look and said that some questions were above his clearance level. The delegation arrived in the afternoon, 5 beings of various species, all wearing the formal robes of the Galactic Council's diplomatic corps. Leading them was Ambassador Thuron, tall humanoid with blue-gray skin and eyes like polished obsidian. He carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to power, and he barely acknowledged Nathan as they walked through the corridors toward cell block 7. Nathan unlocked cell 42 and the delegation entered. Marcus was standing by the window, his back straight, his hands clasped behind him in a posture that suddenly seemed less like that of a prisoner and more like that of someone receiving subordinates. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Ambassador Thuron bowed, an act that shocked Nathan to his core. Council ambassadors did not bow to prisoners. The other delegates followed suit, their movements reverent, almost worshipful. Thuron spoke in formal, galactic standard, his words measured and careful. He addressed Marcus not by that name but as Imperial Majesty. Using titles that made Nathan's blood run cold, he spoke of the Council's concern, of political instability in the outer sectors, of factions calling for the restoration of the old regime. He asked with carefully phrased deference whether the former emperor would consider returning to public life, taking a ceremonial position that might help stabilize the fracturing coalition of worlds. Marcus listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Thuron finished, Marcus turned to look at Nathan, and in that moment Nathan saw his friend differently. The kind old man who had patiently taught him chess was still there, but beneath that gentleness was something else, a core of iron that had once commanded the loyalty of 1,000 worlds. Marcus declined in a voice that carried the weight of absolute finality. He said his time had passed, that he had made his mistakes and accepted the consequences. The galaxy needed to move forward without him, to build something new rather than resurrect the bones of a dead empire. He thanked the council for their consideration, but asked to be left in peace to serve out his sentence. Delegates argued, presenting proposals and contingencies, but Marcus remained unmoved. Finally, Thuron bowed again and led his delegation from the cell. As they passed Nathan in the doorway, the ambassador paused and said quietly that Nathan should consider himself honored that few had ever earned the genuine friendship of Emperor Kale Marcus Stavros, architect of the Pax Galactica, and the most powerful human to ever live. The cell door closed and Nathan stood frozen in the corridor, his mind reeling. Emperor Stavros, the name resonated through his memories like thunder. Every child in human space learned about Stavros in school, the general who had unified humanity during the species wars, the diplomat who had forged the first lasting peace between humans and alien civilizations, the emperor who had ruled justly for 40 years before vanishing in the political upheaval that followed the succession crisis. Nathan had played chess with a legend, shared coffee with the man who had shaped galactic civilization, confided his dreams to someone who had literally decided the fates of billions. And he had never known. When Nathan returned to cell 42 the next day, unsure of what to say or how to act, Marcus was sitting at the chessboard as always. He looked up with the same warm smile, gestured to the empty chair, and asked if Nathan was ready for their game. Nathan sat slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his pieces. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask the 1,000 questions burning in his mind. But Marcus raised a gentle hand and shook his head. Marcus said he hoped Nathan could understand why he had not revealed his identity. He had desperately needed, to be just a man. Again, to have a relationship built on genuine connection rather than awe or Fear or political calculation, he asked. If they could continue as before, just two friends playing chess, or if Nathan felt the need to treat him differently. Now Nathan thought about it really. Thought about it, he looked at the man across from him, seeing both the friend who had taught him patience and strategy and the emperor who had once commanded fleets and negotiated treaties that shaped civilizations. Then he moved his pawn forward and said they should continue as before because Marcus had been right. Friendship based on who someone truly was mattered more than friendship based on what they had accomplished. Relief flooded Marcus's features and they played. The game was different somehow, charged with unspoken understanding, but no less genuine. Nathan found himself playing better than ever, as if the revelation had freed him from some unconscious deference he had not known he was holding. Over the following weeks, their relationship evolved. Marcus began to share stories from his past, not with the grand rhetoric of a ruler recounting glory, but with the honest reflection of a man examining his life. He spoke of victories that tasted like ash because of the lives lost achieving them, of compromises that haunted him decades later, of the loneliness that came with power so absolute that genuine friendship became impossible. He told Nathan about the succession crisis, the brutal political infighting that had erupted when he tried to transition the empire toward democratic governance. He had believed the galaxy was ready, that the institutions he had built were strong enough to survive his abdication. He had been wrong. The resulting chaos had killed millions and nearly shattered the fragile peace between species. Marcus confessed that his imprisonment was partially self-imposed. When the new coalition government had stabilized, they had offered him exile on a paradise world, a quiet retirement with every luxury, but he had refused, insisting on imprisonment as penance for his failure to properly prepare for succession, for his arrogance in believing he alone could determine when humanity was ready for self-governance. Nathan listened, and as he listened, he began to understand the weight his friend carried. The chess games took on new meaning. Each match was not just a game, but a meditation on strategy, consequence, and the price of leadership. When Marcus sacrificed a piece to protect his king, Nathan saw echoes of the decisions emperors made, choosing which lives to spend and which to save. When Nathan found creative solutions using unexpected tactics, Marcus would smile and say that was the kind of thinking the galaxy needed now. Innovation unburdened by the weight of history. One evening, as they finished a particularly challenging game, Nathan asked the question that had been building inside him. He asked if Marcus regretted it all. If given the chance, he would choose a different path. Marcus was quiet for a long time, his fingers tracing the edge of the chessboard. Then he said that regret was a luxury leaders could not afford while in power, but a necessity once power was gone. He regretted the wars he could not prevent, the compromises that betrayed his principles, the personal relationships sacrificed on the altar of duty, but he did not regret the overall arc of what he had tried to build, the attempt to create a galaxy where different species could coexist, where humanity could be a force for stability rather than conquest. He added with a slight smile that he particularly did not regret these afternoons, these quiet games that had given him more peace than all his years of imperial splendor, Nathan felt something shift inside him. He realized that the friendship he had stumbled into was teaching him lessons more valuable than any formal education. Through Marcus, he was learning that greatness and failure often dwelt in the same heart, that power without wisdom was tyranny, and that redemption was a journey rather than a destination. Seasons changed, and winter settled over Orbeg's prime with unusual ferocity. Detention facility's heating system struggled, and Nathan began bringing extra blankets along with the coffee. Marcus accepted them with thanks, joking that emperors were not as hardy as common soldiers, that he had grown soft in his palace years. During these cold months, other prisoners began to notice Nathan's regular visits to Cell 42. Rumors spread, as they always did in confined spaces. Some claimed Marcus was a high-ranking official in witness protection, others whispered darker theories involving espionage and treason. A few inmates, older ones who had served in the imperial military, began to suspect the truth, but they kept their silence, respecting the old man's obvious desire for privacy. Nathan found himself defending his friend too, curious who questioned why he spent so much time with one prisoner. He deflected with bureaucratic language, claiming he was fulfilling his duties as cultural liaison, ensuring the inmates' mental well-being through regular social interaction. Most accepted this explanation with shrugs, but Warden Cole watched him with knowing eyes, never commenting but clearly aware that something deeper was occurring. It was during a particularly harsh blizzard that Nathan arrived to find Marcus looking frailer than usual. The old man insisted he was fine, just tired, but Nathan noticed the slight tremor in his hands as he set up the chessboard. They played slowly that day, and Marcus made uncharacteristic mistakes, his legendary tactical mind seeming to falter. Nathan suggested they skip the game, just talk instead, but Marcus refused with gentle stubbornness. He said these games were important, that they represented continuity, routine, normalcy in a life that had been anything but normal. He moved his knight, a poor placement that Nathan immediately capitalized on, and Marcus smiled, acknowledging the error. As they played, Marcus began to speak about legacy, about what people left behind when they departed. He said he had once been obsessed with how history would remember him, spending countless hours ensuring documents portrayed him favorably, manipulating narratives to cement his place as a great leader. But now, in this cell with genuine friendship and simple games, he realized that personal legacy mattered less than the structures and ideas that outlived individuals. He told Nathan that their friendship was, in a small way, his true legacy, not the treaties or the battles, not the reforms or the infrastructure projects, but the simple human connection between two people who saw each other clearly and chose companionship. If he had taught Nathan anything useful, if their conversations had made Nathan a better person, then something meaningful would continue after Marcus was gone, rippling outward in ways grand history could never measure. Nathan felt tears prickling his eyes but blinked them away. He told Marcus that he had learned more in these months than in all his formal schooling, that their friendship had fundamentally changed how he understood leadership, power, and responsibility. He promised that whatever came next, he would carry these lessons forward. Marcus reached across the chessboard and clasped Nathan's hand, a gesture of profound affection. He said that Nathan had given him an equal gift, the reminder that, beneath all titles and accomplishments, people were still just people needing connection and understanding. In teaching Nathan chess, Marcus had rediscovered his own humanity, the parts of himself buried under decades of imperial responsibility. The winter eventually yielded to spring, and Marcus's health improved. The frailty that had concerned Nathan faded, and the old man seemed revitalized, as if surviving the cold months had renewed his strength. They returned to their regular games with renewed enthusiasm, and Nathan noticed his own skills had improved significantly. He was winning perhaps one game in 5 now, a dramatic improvement from his complete ineptitude. At the beginning, one afternoon, a new prisoner arrived in cell block 7, a young woman named Alexis Miles, who had been arrested for leading protests against corporate exploitation on one of the colony worlds. She was angry, defiant, refusing to cooperate with the facility staff. Warden Cole, aware of Nathan's success with Marcus, asked if he might try to establish rapport with the new inmate. Nathan agreed, and during his first meeting with Alexis, he found himself unconsciously using techniques Marcus had taught him. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions rather than making judgments, and found common ground by discussing literature and philosophy. Alexis remained guarded, but Nathan saw her gradually begin to trust him, to see him as something other than another cog in the oppressive system she was fighting against. When Nathan mentioned this success to Marcus during their next game, the old man smiled with obvious pride. He said that Nathan was learning to see people rather than categories, to approach each individual with genuine curiosity rather than preconceived notions. That skill, Marcus noted, was more valuable than any amount of tactical knowledge or political theory. Marcus suggested Nathan might consider a different career path, something in diplomacy or social work where his developing abilities could affect real change. Nathan admitted he had been thinking along similar lines, that working in the detention facility had shown him both the failures of the justice system and the potential for rehabilitation when people were treated with dignity. Their conversation was interrupted by alarms blaring through the facility. Security protocols activated, doors sealing automatically. Through the cell window, Nathan could see vessels descending through the atmosphere, military craft bearing insignias he recognized from news reports. The Centauri Rebellion, a separatist movement that had been gaining strength in the outer colonies, was launching an attack on Orbex Prime. The facility shuddered as explosions rocked the area surrounding it. Staff members ran through corridors, evacuating to emergency shelters. Nathan moved to leave, to follow evacuation protocols, but Marcus called him back. With quiet urgency, the old man stood by the window, watching the descending ships with an expression Nathan had never seen before, the face of a military commander assessing battlefield conditions. Marcus spoke rapidly, his voice carrying an authority that made Nathan instinctively obey. He said the rebel forces were likely targeting the detention facility specifically, hoping to capture high-value political prisoners for leverage. The facility's defenses were minimal, designed to keep people in rather than protect against Military assault. Marcus told Nathan to go to the security office, override the cell locks in Block 7, and evacuate the prisoners to the underground shelters beneath the administration building. Those shelters had been built during the Species Wars and could withstand significant bombardment. Nathan protested that releasing prisoners violated every protocol, but Marcus cut him off, explaining that protocols meant nothing if everyone died in the facility when it was destroyed. Nathan hesitated for only a moment before running toward the security office. The facility was in chaos, with staff members panicking and the warden trying to coordinate with planetary defense forces. Nathan accessed the security terminal, his hands shaking as he initiated the override sequence that would unlock all cells in Block 7. Warning lights flashed and automated voices announced the security breach, but Nathan ignored them, focused on completing the evacuation Marcus had outlined. He ran back through the corridors, shouting for prisoners to follow him to the shelters. Most were too frightened to question, filing out of their cells and following his directions. Alexis emerged from her cell, eyes wide with fear and confusion. Nathan grabbed her arm and pushed her toward the emergency stairs, yelling for her to help guide others to the underground levels. She nodded and immediately began organizing prisoners into groups, her natural leadership abilities emerging in the crisis. Nathan raced back to cell 42, where Marcus was calmly waiting. The old man had changed. Somehow, his posture straighter, his bearing commanding. He told Nathan to leave to save himself and the others. But Nathan refused. He said they would go together or not at all. A massive explosion tore through the facility's eastern wing. The building groaned, structural supports failing. Through the window, Nathan saw rebel soldiers advancing across the courtyard, their weapons firing at the few security personnel attempting to mount a defense. Marcus moved to the cell's communication panel, a rarely used system meant for emergencies. He activated it and began speaking in a voice that echoed with imperial authority, broadcasting on open channels that the rebel forces would be monitoring. He identified himself using his full name and titles and demanded to speak with the rebel commander. Immediately, the assault paused, soldiers freezing in confusion. Within moments, a response crackled through the communication system. The rebel commander, a man named Victor Kane, spoke with barely restrained fury and awe, clearly shocked that the legendary Emperor was present at this forgotten facility. Marcus negotiated with skills honed over decades of diplomacy. He confirmed his presence, offered himself as a hostage in exchange for a ceasefire that would allow the facility staff and prisoners to evacuate safely. He spoke of honor, of the rebel cause's stated goal of protecting the innocent, and of how history would judge Kane's actions. In this moment, the rebel commander agreed, ordering his forces to stand down while evacuation proceeded, but he demanded Marcus surrender himself immediately, threatening to resume the assault if there was any deception. Nathan protested, but Marcus silenced him with a look. He said this was his choice, that the lives of everyone in the facility were worth more than his freedom. He added that perhaps this was meant to be, that his imprisonment had served its purpose, and whatever came next would be part of a larger pattern he could not yet see. Marcus asked Nathan for one final favor. he requested that Nathan take the chessboard from his cell, keep it, and remember their games. He said that sometime in the future, when Nathan had his own students or friends, he should pass on the lessons learned across this board, ensuring that wisdom continued to flow from generation to generation. Nathan took the chessboard with trembling hands, tears now flowing freely. He thanked Marcus for everything, for the friendship, the lessons, the example of grace under impossible circumstances. Marcus embraced him briefly, a gesture of deep affection, then straightened his shoulders and walked toward the cell door with the bearing of an emperor going to meet his destiny. The evacuation proceeded under the watchful eyes of rebel soldiers. Staff and prisoners filed into the underground shelters, the unlikely coalition united by their shared humanity in the face of violence. Nathan coordinated from the shelter entrance, ensuring everyone reached safety, the chessboard clutched under one arm like a sacred relic. When the last person was secure, Nathan watched through the shelter's periscope as Marcus emerged from the facility, walking alone across the courtyard toward the rebel forces. The old man moved with dignity, his silver hair catching the light, his posture unbowed. Despite his age and circumstance, rebel soldiers surrounded him, their weapons trained but their expressions confused, uncertain how to treat this living legend who had voluntarily surrendered. Commander Kane emerged from an assault transport, and even from a distance, Nathan could see the man's shock at being in the presence of Emperor Stavros. Marcus spoke to Kane, too far away for Nathan to hear, but body language conveyed the conversation's nature. The rebel commander listened, occasionally gesturing, clearly arguing, but Marcus remained calm, patient, using the same teaching tone Nathan had heard across the chessboard countless times. The standoff lasted nearly an hour. Then unexpectedly, Kane ordered his soldiers to stand down completely. The rebel force began withdrawing, their vessels lifting back into orbit, taking Marcus with them but leaving the facility intact and unharmed. In the days that followed, the galaxy learned what had transpired. Emperor Stavros, thought to be dead or disappeared, had emerged from hidden imprisonment to negotiate not just the safety of one detention facility, but a broader ceasefire in the Centauri rebellion. Using his legendary diplomatic skills and moral authority, he had brokered meetings between rebel leaders and the coalition government, forcing both sides to negotiate rather than fight. The former emperor had insisted on specific conditions, refusing to return to power, but demanding reforms that addressed the legitimate grievances driving the rebellion. He spoke on public broadcasts about the failures of leadership, about systems that prioritized control over justice, and about the need for humanity to remember that power existed to serve people rather than dominate them. Within months, a peace framework emerged, flawed and imperfect but workable, creating paths toward addressing colonial exploitation while maintaining interstellar stability. Marcus remained involved only as a mediator, refusing titles or positions, insisting that new leaders must build the future rather than resurrect the past. Nathan followed these developments from Orbix Prime, where he had been promoted to director of inmate rehabilitation programs in recognition of his actions during the crisis. He implemented reforms based on the lessons Marcus had taught him, treating prisoners as individuals, capable of change rather than problems. To be contained. Alexis Miles released. As part of the peace agreement, joined Nathan's staff, bringing passion and idealism tempered by the wisdom gained. Through adversity, together they transformed the they into a model for rehabilitative justice, and their work attracted attention from other institutions across human space. Nathan kept the chessboard in his office, and true to his promise, he used it to teach others. He played with inmates struggling to find purpose, with staff members needing to understand patience and strategy, with visitors curious about the legendary games between a liaison officer and an emperor. Each time he set up the pieces, Nathan remembered Marcus's lessons. The importance of thinking several moves ahead, of considering consequences before acting, of protecting the vulnerable even at cost to oneself. He taught that every piece had value, that pawns could become queens with persistence and proper support, and that the king, despite being the most important piece, was also the most limited, requiring others to achieve true safety. Years passed, and Nathan occasionally saw Marcus in news broadcasts, the old man's silver hair now completely white, his movements slower but his mind still sharp as a blade. They never met again in person, their paths diverging as both pursued the work they had discovered through their friendship. But Nathan received occasional messages, brief notes that arrived through untraceable channels, written in the precise hand Nathan remembered from score sheets of their chess games. Marcus wrote about seeing news of the rehabilitation programs, about pride in his students' accomplishments, about hope that the lessons they had shared were spreading through actions rather than proclamations. In one message, Marcus confessed that the time in cell 42 had been the most peaceful period of his life, that their daily games had provided sanctuary from the weight of history and the burden of legacy. He thanked Nathan for seeing him as simply Marcus, for treating him as a friend rather than a symbol, and for reminding him why leadership mattered in the first place. Nathan responded rarely, knowing that Marcus's communications were likely monitored by multiple intelligence agencies, but he sent occasional updates, brief descriptions of lives changed through the programs they had discussed, of former inmates who had found purpose and redemption through being treated with dignity rather than contempt. The chessboard became famous in its own right. Journalists wrote articles about the games between Brooks and Stavros. Scholars analyzed the recorded matches for insights into the emperor's strategic thinking, and the board itself was eventually donated to a museum dedicated to the history of galactic diplomacy. But before that donation, Nathan used it for one final game. His former student Alexis had risen to become coordinator of rehabilitation programs for the entire outer colonial region, and she needed advice on handling a particularly difficult situation involving political prisoners similar to those Nathan had once overseen. They sat in Nathan's office, the chessboard between them, and as Nathan taught Alexis the lessons Marcus had taught him, he felt the continuity Marcus had spoken about. Wisdom flowing from teacher to student to teacher again, each generation adding their experiences while preserving the core insights that made the knowledge valuable. Alexis learned quickly, just as Nathan had, and watching her development, Nathan understood what Marcus had meant about legacy. The treaties and reforms would be studied in history classes, but this personal transmission of wisdom, this chain of teaching and learning and applying knowledge to make individual lives better, this was how change truly occurred. Nathan eventually retired, content with the transformation he had helped facilitate. The detention facility on Orbex Prime was no longer a forgotten warehouse for politically inconvenient prisoners, but a genuine center for rehabilitation and education, a model that other institutions studied and attempted to emulate. In his retirement, Nathan wrote extensively about his experiences, producing memoirs that focused less on the famous chess games with an emperor and more on the lessons learned about human dignity, the potential for redemption, and the responsibility that came with any form of power, whether imperial or institutional. His writings influenced a generation of social workers, prison administrators, and policymakers. The core message remained consistent with what Marcus had taught him, that systems existed to serve people, that authority without compassion was tyranny, and that genuine change required seeing individuals clearly rather than reducing them to categories or statistics. Nathan received a final message from Marcus on the old man's deathbed. The former emperor, now well into his 90s, wrote with a shaking hand that his time was ending peacefully, surrounded by the few genuine friends he had made in his final years. He expressed no regrets about stepping away from power, no longing for the grandeur of his imperial days. Instead, Marcus wrote about gratitude for the afternoon games, for the friendship that had taught him more about being human than all his decades of ruling. He said that if the universe granted any form of continuation after death, he hoped for an endless supply of challenging opponents and real coffee, and he looked forward to seeing if Nathan had learned any new strategies worth testing. Nathan cried when he read that message, sitting alone in his study with only memories and the donated replica chessboard the museum had provided. He had lost his friend, his teacher, the most influential person. His life and the galaxy had lost one of its great architects. But as tears fell, Nathan also smiled, remembering the warmth in Marcus's eyes during their first game, the patience as the old man taught a fumbling beginner, the genuine joy when Nathan finally began to understand the deeper strategies. Those memories were precious beyond measure, proof that even legends were ultimately just people seeking connection and meaning. The funeral was a state affair, with delegations from hundreds of world, speeches by politicians who had never met Marcus personally, and ceremonies that the emperor himself would have found tediously excessive. Nathan attended quietly, sitting far from the dignitaries, refusing interviews, simply present to honor his friend. After the official proceedings, there was a smaller gathering for those who had genuinely known Marcus personally, former staff members from his imperial days, diplomats who had worked with him during the peace negotiations, and a handful of individuals like Nathan who had connected with the man rather than the legend. They shared stories, and Nathan contributed his own, speaking about daily chess games and the lessons learned. Others told similar tales, and a picture emerged of Marcus as someone who had carried immense burdens with grace, who had never lost sight of individual humanity despite operating on galactic scales, and who had sought redemption not through grand gestures, but through countless small acts of teaching and connection. As Nathan prepared to leave, an aide approached with a package. Inside was the original chessboard from Cell 42, returned from Marcus's estate, with a note explaining that the Emperor had purchased it from the facility shortly after his release, intending it as a gift for Nathan, but waiting for the appropriate moment. That moment apparently was now. Nathan held the board, feeling its familiar weight, seeing the slight wear on certain pieces from their hundreds of games. Attached was a final letter, written years ago. Preparation for this day, Marcus's clear handwriting covering several pages. Letter contained no grand philosophical statements or revelations. Instead, it was simply a thank you note expressing appreciation for friendship, companionship, and the reminder that beneath all titles and accomplishments, people were defined by how they treated others in small, private moments. Marcus wrote that Nathan had saved him not during the rebel attack, but every day, by choosing to see a lonely old man rather than a fallen emperor, by offering genuine friendship without agenda. Marcus encouraged Nathan to continue teaching, to keep playing chess, to pass on the lessons to anyone who would listen. He ended with a challenge, a chess problem sketched on the final page, marked as difficult but solvable. The note indicated this was Marcus's finest puzzle, designed specifically for Nathan, and he hoped Nathan would enjoy solving it as much as Marcus had enjoyed creating it. Nathan returned home and spent the evening working on the puzzle. It was indeed difficult, requiring everything Marcus had taught him about patience, foresight, and creative thinking. Hours passed as Nathan moved pieces in his mind, testing possibilities, following threads of logic to their conclusions. Near midnight, Nathan found the solution, an elegant sequence that sacrificed significant material to achieve checkmate through unexpected means. It was beautiful, a masterpiece of chess composition, and Nathan laughed through tears as he realized the puzzle was a metaphor for Marcus's own life, giving up power and position to achieve a more important victory, peace and stability bought through personal sacrifice. The years continued their relentless march. Nathan grew old himself, his hair turning gray, his movements slowing, but his mind remaining sharp, honed by decades of chess and strategic thinking. He continued teaching, writing, and mentoring, ensuring that the wisdom Marcus had shared was not lost. His former students spread across the galaxy, taking positions in rehabilitation centers, diplomatic corps, educational institutions, and policy organizations. Each carried forward the core lessons, creating ripples that expanded into waves of change, reforming how societies treated prisoners, how governments approached dissent, and how individuals in power understood their responsibilities. Nathan never claimed credit for this influence, always attributing his insights to Marcus's teaching. When asked about his famous friendship with Emperor Stavros, Nathan would smile and describe not the grand historical figure, but the kind man who had patiently taught chess to a mediocre player who had made an effort despite vast differences in experience and background. He emphasized that Marcus's greatest achievement was not the treaties or reforms, but the decision to step down when power became counterproductive, to choose imprisonment over empire when pride might have demanded otherwise, and 2. Spend his final years teaching anyone willing to learn rather than writing self-aggrandizing memoirs on Nathan's own deathbed, surrounded by former students and colleagues. Someone asked if he had any regrets. Nathan considered the question with the thoughtfulness Marcus had instilled in him, then replied that he regretted not bringing better coffee those first few months, that he wished he had understood sooner who Marcus was so they could have discussed the old man's experiences more deeply, but that overall he felt blessed beyond measure. He said the chess games had taught him that every life was valuable, every person deserved dignity, and that power without compassion was ultimately empty. Those lessons had guided his entire career, shaped how he related to others, and given him purpose beyond simple existence. As Nathan's breathing slowed, his final words were quiet thanks to Marcus, acknowledgement that a chance assignment to check on a forgotten prisoner had become the defining relationship of his life, proof that friendship could bridge any gap if both people approached it with sincerity and openness. The detention facility on Orbex Prime eventually closed, replaced by a comprehensive rehabilitation center that bore both Nathan Brooks's and Marcus Stavros's names. Inside the main entrance stood a sculpture, 2 figures sitting across a chessboard from each other, faces reflecting concentration and mutual respect, capturing the essence of a friendship that had influenced galactic civilization in ways official histories struggled to measure. Students at the center learned about the legendary chess games, studying the recorded matches for strategic insights and philosophical lessons. They discussed how 2 vastly different individuals had found common ground, how teaching and learning created bonds that transcended circumstance, and how small daily interactions could accumulate into transformative change. The chessboard itself, the original from Cell 42, was displayed in a transparent case in the center's library, available for viewing, but no longer used for games. A plaque explained its significance, detailing the daily matches between a cultural liaison officer and the former emperor, games that had taught both men lessons about humanity, redemption, and the true nature of legacy. Visitors often stood before the chessboard in contemplative silence, seeing in the worn pieces evidence of dedication and friendship. Some came seeking inspiration for their own work in rehabilitation and reform. Others arrived as pilgrims of sorts, drawn to this artifact, exemplified the best possibilities of human connection. The puzzle Marcus had created for Nathan was eventually published in a collection of famous chess problems, and solving it became a rite of passage for serious players. Elegant solution, requiring sacrifice and vision, was analyzed endlessly, with commentators noting how it reflected the philosophical principles Marcus had advocated throughout his life. But for those who had known Nathan personally, who had heard him speak about the daily games with obvious affection, the puzzle's true significance lay not in its technical brilliance, but in what it represented: a final gift from teacher to student, a challenge presented with love, proof that friendship persisted beyond physical presence. The reforms Marcus and Nathan had advocated slowly, imperfectly, incompletely became standard practice across much of human space and beyond. Prisons evolved into rehabilitation centers, punishment yielded to restoration, and the fundamental dignity of all beings became a guiding principle rather than empty rhetoric. Historians debated which of Marcus's achievements mattered most: the military victories, the diplomatic breakthroughs, the institutional reforms. But those who studied his life deeply understood that perhaps his greatest legacy was demonstrating that power could be voluntarily relinquished, that leaders could step back when necessary, and that wisdom could be shared as generously as authority had once been wielded. In classrooms across the galaxy, teachers used the story of Brooks and Stavros to illustrate principles about leadership, friendship, and personal growth. The narrative had everything: students responded to drama and revelation, humility and greatness intertwined, and most importantly, the message that every interaction mattered, that treating people with dignity and respect created outcomes no amount of force could achieve. Young people entering fields related to justice and rehabilitation cited Nathan and Marcus as inspiration, their chess games symbolizing patient teaching, the gradual transmission of wisdom from one generation to the next. The story reminded them that change occurred through countless small actions rather than sudden revolutions, that persistence and compassion ultimately accomplished more than anger and demands. The legacy continued through unexpected channels. A composer created a symphony inspired by the chess games, using musical themes to represent different pieces and their movements, building to a crescendo that captured the moment of Nathan's first victory. The piece became widely performed, introducing audiences to the story through pure emotion. A playwright wrote a drama focusing on the game's dialogue, drawn from Nathan's memoirs and Marcus's letters, scenes capturing the evolution of their friendship against the backdrop of galactic events. The play ran for years, moving audiences with its exploration of redemption, friendship, and the weight of legacy. Artists created visual representations, paintings and sculptures depicting the two men at their chessboard, expressions thoughtful, the space between them charged with respect and affection. These works hung in galleries and private collections, serving as reminders that the most profound relationships often developed in quiet moments rather than grand events. But perhaps the most significant legacy was impossible to measure: the countless individuals who, hearing the story, decided to treat others with greater dignity, to seek connection across barriers, to teach patiently rather than condemn harshly. Small decisions, private choices that accumulated into cultural shift no single person could claim credit for. The galaxy Marcus had helped shape continued evolving long after both he and Nathan were gone. New challenges emerged, old conflicts resurfaced in different forms, and the imperfect peace they had worked toward required constant maintenance. But the principles they had exemplified, patience, dignity, strategic thinking, combined with compassion, remained relevant guides for navigating complexity in detention facilities, rehabilitation centers, diplomatic negotiations, educational institutions, and countless other settings. People consciously or unconsciously applied lessons Marcus had taught Nathan, who had taught others, who continued the chain of transmission that defines civilization's moral progress. The chess games, those daily sessions in Cell 42, became more than historical curiosities. They transformed into parables, teaching, tools, and inspirations, proof that friendship could exist anywhere, that wisdom resided in unexpected places, and that the choice to see others clearly, without preconceptions or prejudices, created possibilities that shaped futures in ways grand historical forces never could. And somewhere in the collective memory of galactic civilization, two men sat across a chessboard, pieces moving in patterns. Both players understood, coffee cups steaming gently, friendship evident. Their focused silence, the specific games faded into history, but the essence of what they represented, human connection transcending circumstance, wisdom shared across generations, redemption found through teaching, persisted as long as anyone remembered to tell the story. That persistence was Marcus's true immortality, not in monuments or history books, but in the living transmission of his final lessons, taught patiently to a young man who had simply wanted to pass time with a lonely prisoner, never knowing he was receiving an education more valuable than any formal degree, lessons that would ripple outward through decades and across civilizations, changing the galaxy. One chess game, one friendship, one choice to treat others with dignity at a time, and that was the end of the story. If you listened all the way to here, don't forget to leave feedback about what you thought of the story in the comments, whether positive or negative. Your feedback helps us improve. Also, leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. And I'll leave here on the screen another video that I'm sure you'll like. Big hug, and see you in the next story.